mainly from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, actors were making a lot of movies per year because until you got into the 50s, TV didn't really start coming into play, and movies were kind of a hybrid of what we have now of TV and film. There were a lot more movies being produced. Actors were under contract. They were able to move from movie to movie a lot quicker than actors are now. They didn't have as much agency as to what they would do or where they would go, and they were just being pumped out movie after movie. Needless to say, someone like Bette Davis had a long filmography, and as we were going through it, it's like, how do we get this down to 10 movies? Wow, this is going to be tough. We would actually probably have to watch at least 15 to decide which 10 would be worth spotlighting. So it didn't really save us any time at all. So that's when I just threw it out there, and you quickly, without hesitation, jumped on board with maybe we should just pick one movie and go with it. And I think there were a few we considered. The ones that really stuck out to me are some of her earlier works and then some of her later works. This was kind of a mid-career film that we picked, All About Eve, in that it was when her career started dwindling down. She was in her 40s, and this helped give her a resurrection. This was kind of a soft spot in her career, obviously, from what I just mentioned. Aside from this movie, I don't know if there were a lot of movies in this time period that she did that were considered masterpieces. A lot of her really good work came when she was young, and then when she was older, movies like Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, I think really stood out to me. And then a lot of her early works that made her become famous in the first place. We did talk about one Bette Davis movie previously on a podcast.
Oh, yes. The Petrified Forest.
Petrified Forest. I know it was something
Yes.
Forest. So
Yes.
we did go over the Petrified Forest with a very young Bette Davis. She is my favorite actress of all time. And I would say that because one is it's hard to have a favorite actress. See, this is why I said I shouldn't go first, because I'd end up talking. You're like, no, you go first. I'll interrupt
Yeah.
you. I haven't even gotten to the movie yet.
No, I know.
Here comes another 4-hour podcast about one movie.
Oh, man.
So, one of the reasons Bette Davis is my favorite actress is because with actresses, it's hard to have a favorite, to be honest with you, because there aren't a lot of films where the actress is there's a lead actress in every film, but there aren't a lot of films where the actress is the lead of the film. You have a lot of actresses that play supporting parts. They're not necessarily the best parts in the movie. When you come to more modern times, actresses aren't in a lot of films. So you may have someone like Julia Roberts or Sandra Bullock that have lengthy careers, but they generally get those lengthy careers from making very fluff type movies. I'm sure there are a lot of people that would say those are some of their favorite actresses, but I wouldn't. They don't make the type of films that I would be passionate about. They're more so romantic comedies. And to get an actress that really goes after really good, meaty parts, I think of like a Nicole Kidman, Jodie Foster, but they don't make nearly as many movies. So it's like when you look at their filmography, you're like, man, I love Nicole Kidman in Eyes Wide Shut and To Die For and The Others and and then you know you just it starts getting very thin. You start kind of having to reach a little bit more, and and that's kind of the problem. But when you get to Bette Davis or actresses that made films in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the filmographies are so big that they can afford to have several bombs, but then still have 8, 9, 10 movies that are just great. And that's just from a volume standpoint. So that's why for me, when I think of my favorite actors, they generally come from that era. Unless you have a Jack Nicholson, who's again one of my favorite actors, but he's been acting for so long that he's built up a filmography where you can look at like Shining and A Few Good Men and the original Batman or Batman '89 and just One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I could just go on and on and on of the great films he's made. So for me, that's kind of why Bette Davis is up there for me, because she was someone who was really dedicated to her craft to a fault. And I say this every time she comes up, and she's come up a lot of times when I've done videos, reviews, podcasting, whatever. I do bring it up a lot. I do bring her up a lot, that she wasn't the greatest person in the world. And the more I research her, the more I hear stories about her, the less I think of her as a person. But all of the negative things come from her putting her career first and putting the part first and being vindictive and being cunning. And she's kind of like more like Eve in a
Yes.
way than anything else. Those qualities made her get the better parts. You know, she didn't go about it the most ethical way, but she did what she had to do to get the best parts available to her. So she was in a lot of great movies, and then she did step up a lot in those movies. So for those reasons, the fact that she has such a high volume of films, the fact that her films have such high quality, she worked with quality directors, she put out quality work for a long period of time beyond the studio era that ended in the 50s, and that resurrection she had late in her career. Just her overall body of work is kind of why she's one of my favorite actors. And again, there's a unique time period in her career. This movie kind of gave her that second life. And thank goodness it did, because it gave us a lot more great works from a great actress. We landed on Bette Davis, and ultimately, I guess I'll let you step in here and say your piece on Betty, and I'll let you explain how we ended up getting on All About Eve, how we decided to land on that one.
Okay, well, I was going to say that I remember taking a film course when I was young, and some woman in the class commented, we were watching an old movie, and she commented that she was pleased to see that the female character in this movie was strong, you know, and it was more like a modern character, not like an old-fashioned character. And the professor said, well, actually, I think that female characters in older movies are a lot better than female characters in modern movies. You know, they've kind of been relegated to the girlfriend of the hero or the wife of the hero. Like, there aren't that many great roles for women in modern times. Whereas back in the 30s and 40s, when actresses like Bette Davis were at the top of their game, there were a lot of really great roles for women, and there were a lot of big stars who were women. And I think that today, when you talk about great actresses, a lot of them do their best work in small independent films, right? They can't, you know, they don't really get the big blockbusters the way that, I don't know, say Arnold Schwarzenegger could be in a blockbuster film. But a lot of the, you know, best actress nominees will wind up, you know, they're coming from small movies, right? They're not the big mainstream movies the way, say, Bette Davis would have been back in the 30s, 40s, and in the 50s. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. And I think that's one reason why we have a lot of great actresses from that classic period. And Bette Davis is certainly one of them. And in terms of how we wound up on this film, well, I think it was just one of the films that we had on the list that was an absolute must. And you know, from my point of view, I thought, gee, I haven't seen this film in a while, so I would like to look at it again. So I kind of said, hey, let's do that one. But I don't recall if we had a really more of a reason than that. But I thought it would be a great excuse to revisit a great movie. And All About Eve, I think, is a great movie. And I think you're right that it's kind of the movie that resurrected her career, because she maybe wasn't quite box office poison the way sometimes they label actors or actresses box office poison. She wasn't quite there, but she'd made some films that didn't really do that well. And this was an opportunity for her to get back in a really good film. And I think everybody agrees that the script by Joseph Mankiewicz was an excellent script, like just one of the best scripts possibly ever written. And so right away, when she had the chance to do it, she thought, oh yes, I want to do this movie. Yeah, so I think I was very pleased to get to look at this movie again.
Yeah, it's interesting because the last podcast we did, one of the movies we covered was Mommy Dearest, a movie that you loved and you thought was a genuinely great movie for some strange reason. But that was based on, I say based using air quotes here since this is a podcast. It was based on Joan Crawford's life, and Joan Crawford is someone who's what go on to star in Bette Davis and Baby Jane.
Yes.
And Crawford was someone who also had a 1950s career resurrection, I think with Johnny Guitar, that came out a year after this, and she was considered box office poison. Someone, again, much like Bette Davis, that starred in a lot of movies and was.
She also had the two periods as well, where she was really popular in the 30s and 40s, and then again as an old lady, she sort of starred in a lot of popular movies. So kind of a similar trajectory that way too.
Yeah. When I first saw this movie, it was at a time period where I worked in a hotel I'm still working in now. A while ago, when I first started working there, the owner grew up in a movie theater that his dad owned, and it's all themed with 30s and 40s, mainly 30s and 40s, some 50s movies, original print posters that he watched as a kid. And he kind of was the one who introduced me to films like these, and I watched a lot of them on Turner Classic Films, where they would have the introduction, where they would tell you a little bit about the movie, show you the movie with an intro and an outro, give you a little bit of backdrop. And for me, that was a great experience. It was a great learning period for me for a lot of these films. Yeah, when I was watching them, I would generally go through the eras. I'd go through the 30s and the 40s, and I just go through it by era, and then I eventually circle back to the 20s because it was a little bit much. I wanted to go chronological, but going into silent movies first was a little bit much. You kind of get a little bit warmed up before you can get into the silent film. So I went 30s, 40s, 50s, 20s. You know, the 30s were great, a lot of great gangster films, and we already did a list on some of the great gangster films from Warner Brothers in the 30s. When you got into the 40s, when you got into the film noir, I just thought that was just an amazing genre, an amazing time period. You go by decades and you break it down year by year. This was a great year for films, especially for films about films. Because I believe this year Sunset Boulevard also came out. To watch both of these movies for the first time in relatively close period of time, I was like, man, what was in the water in 1950? Because there were some great films. I mean, those are two at the top of the list, but there's some really good films made around this period of time. I think Sunset Boulevard is remembered more fondly because it's a little bit more artistic. This, like you said, it's an incredible script. It's very dense. They use a lot of analogies. The characters all come off almost like intellectuals. And it's more so the writer's an intellectual, so they're kind of a byproduct of the writer. When you watch a Quentin Tarantino film, everyone's a film expert. It's like, wait a minute, this girl's like 19 years old. How did she even hear about any of these movies? She should be talking about TikTok and Facebook and like Twitter or whatever. As you get with writers, all the actors are just an extension of that writer. You can tell the writer's an intellectual, he's a smart guy. There's a lot of analogies and double entendres and just biting dialogue, clever dialogue, a lot of cunning scheming. I don't do a lot of reading, but some of the reading I have done, A Song of Ice and Fire, that was turned into Game of Thrones. The reason I love the books and the show, at least for the first couple seasons, was how conniving everyone was, and all the backstabbing and all the planning and all the schemes, and this kind of reminded me of that. There was a lot of similarities there. I just love stuff like that, where you have all these, man, what's their motive? Where are they going with this? And all the setups and the plot twists and the callbacks. The script is just brilliant. I mean, we watched it for Bette Davis, but this was all about the writing and directing for this film.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And some people have commented that it's almost more like a play in a way than a movie. You were commenting about Sunset Boulevard maybe being a little more technically interesting. I think that Joseph Mankiewicz, he was a director who, I mean, he was more about the writing in a way. He was more about the script and the story and the characters.
Because he
And
was originally a writer. He was a
yeah,
writer and a producer, and he wrote some great scripts. And he eventually got his opportunity to direct. But yeah, his heart and soul is a writer.
absolutely. And he really cared about characters, and he really cared about getting to the emotional truth or the psychological truth of the characters. And apparently, he would even uh, give his scripts to a psychiatrist and get an opinion as to whether, is this accurate? Is this right? Does this make sense? Um, which I find interesting because I knew a theater artistic director who used to do that with the plays that he was producing. He would take them to his psychiatrist and say, read this play and give me a report on the characters, which I found strange because it makes sense for Joseph Mankiewicz to do it because he's writing the script. So he can actually change it if it doesn't make sense. If the psychiatrist says, no, a person who has this problem wouldn't really do that, then Mankiewicz could change the script. But an artistic director of a theater should not be changing any scripts. It's against the rules. And so I don't know what you can do with that report other than just say, well, the psychiatrist says this. But it made me wonder if maybe that artistic director had been influenced by Joseph Mankiewicz. But I think he was much more interested in that kind of psychological truth, the characters, and I think he even would go so far as to say that he thought it was wrong for a director to try and put in fancy shots, or anything that would call attention to the shot, because you're kind of pulling people out of the story and the truth. And you're just saying, hey, look at me, I'm the director, and I made the camera do this, and I think in some ways I kind of agree with that. I think just tell the story and let the characters be, let the actors do their thing. And yeah, it is kind of weird when somebody does really fancy things or there's really crazy editing and people go, wow, that director's a genius. Did you see that crazy editing? And I'm going, well, I don't
Angus,
know.
it is a visual medium. I hate
I
to
know.
disagree with you, but it is a visual medium. I mean, this movie is brilliant, but if you were watching it on mute, it would just look like a 1950s TV soap opera or something. It's very visually bland. The one scene I think that was a real exterior scene where they're walking down the block, and it was just walking down the block. It was rear projection,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just so awkward. You could tell like they're walking in place. You could tell like the people behind them weren't really behind them. It just looked very odd. Obviously, probably didn't
Yes.
look odd for 1950, but looking at it now, it just looks very clunky and awkward. And you wonder why they couldn't just shoot at least one scene with them walking down the block. But
Yeah.
visually, I have to strongly disagree with you. This movie leaves a lot to be desired. It is very bland looking. It is, I don't know. It's just a lot of walking in and out of rooms, moving from room to room, not a lot of exterior shots, not a lot of no interesting angles, just two shot, wide shot, close ups. It's a very, very bland looking movie. Great movie, but visually, I don't know, man. I mean,
No, true. True.
you can have a great meal, but when you go to a restaurant, you want a great meal that also looks good. Presentation has to count for something, you
Yes.
know?
Well, I would say there has to be a happy medium, and I think you're right that it is a little bland, and I think that he goes far in that direction, and that's why I say in some ways I agree, but I think there is a happy medium where you can hopefully have some interesting looking shots and maybe do some interesting moves, but it shouldn't draw you out of the story. It shouldn't be so crazy that it's like, whoa, that was an
And it
amazing
shouldn't
camera
be
move.
so bland that it draws you out of the story too. It's like, it can be so bland that that also draws you out of the story as well.
True.
Interesting
True.
enough, the one creative shot was like the last shot in the film,
Yes.
which is a great shot, and
Yes.
it's a great metaphor too, because you're talking about Eve, and Eve is like the first woman, and then you have her usurping her idol, and then here comes someone that views Eve as her idol, and then that woman usurps Eve, the first woman, and then you see what Eve spawns as that young actress looks into the mirror, and we see hundreds of her. This
Yes.
is what Eve spawns. I think that was an interesting metaphor. And the writing, it's a great
Mhm.
shot, but the shot comes from the writing. So
Yes.
I think he inadvertently created a great shot. His writing forced him into a great shot because it aids the script as well, wraps it up in a nice, neat little package with the final shot.
That's right. The shot supports the script. It supports the story. It doesn't take you out of it. And even if it did, it was the last shot of the movie. So at that point, it's okay if you kind of exit. But I don't think it did. I think it supports it, and I think that's important, and that makes sense. But um, but yeah, I think a happy medium would be best.